Game difficulty is a touchy subject because it means something different to everyone. Some games that are challenging to some aren't so to others, and there's a lot of discourse over game difficulty because of it. But how does game difficulty play into a horror game? The first thing we need to look at is what aspect of the game the difficulty is tied to. Something to respect is how Silent Hill 2 and 3 had difficulty options both for the combat and the puzzles. And this is always nice since games will obviously test us in different ways. You're not using the same skill set in Resident Evil to aim at a zombie as you are to figure out the paintings puzzle or the various other puzzles you bump into as you explore the Spencer Mansion. But let's focus on puzzles first, since they've always been a heavy part of horror games for quite a long time. Whilst it's not the originator by far, the trope reaches all the way back to the early 90s with Alone in the Dark, to give you an idea of how long they've been around. Even the puzzles then aren't too challenging, but they serve the purpose of slowing down your progress as you explore. It's pretty much a trope nowadays for a horror game to have a very esoteric puzzle built into it that would go very far out of the way of any expected realism to challenge the player. Why are there 3 dog heads preventing you from walking out the front door of the Baker household? Do they have to find them when they want to leave? Why not just a regular key? Even 10 years after Alone in the Dark the New Nightmare, the tradition continues. Why do I have to search through the family history book to find the birth dates of all the male Morton family members so I can enter them into some paintings to open them up just to get a key and leave? It's really silly when you think about it, but in horror games we let this stuff go because it's just expected by this point. It's almost suspicious when a door is so brazenly unlocked. But when puzzle difficulty affects the horror, it can go either way. Failing a puzzle really leaves little to be afraid of. Most puzzles either tell you you did it wrong immediately and let you retry, but there is so much more stress when there's a clock ticking. Regardless of what you know possible in the game, if you suspect that the failure state of a puzzle will result in death, then you'll work harder to get it right. To go back to Resident Evil once again, if you get the paintings puzzle wrong, the birds that lurk above will attack you, you lose health, and you're worse off for the situation. Of course, you won't realise this to begin with, which makes it more cruel, since whilst it's obvious there are birds in the room, you can't always assume that they're going to activate based on your lack of understanding. But puzzles in games that are harder to comprehend can generally leave a more negative response. Not everyone appreciates a hard puzzle, and even though we live in the era of being able to look up solutions to things immediately online, a puzzle that's too hard to figure out or relies on flawed logic can really leave a level of disdain for the game from the player and take them out of the moment. Or worse, a puzzle that's arbitrarily employed, like the random slide puzzle in Silent Hill Homecoming. Point-and-click games are subject to this sort of thing a lot due to their progression being tied to puzzles, the whole game essentially being a string of puzzles to complete, and not understanding how to progress can drop the pacing of a game that's already slow, like a point-and-click horror game, to a dead stop and lose people in the process. But this isn't the kind of difficulty you were expecting when you started the video. Difficulty has many shapes and forms, but the most traditional one is skill and its issues. Once again, it's never as easy as you expect. Many games are difficult in different ways, some through the deliberate design, and others through game limitations. The original Resident Evil works around the premise of tank controls, which makes turning to shoot an enemy something that needs to be calculated well before it's executed. The tank controls are a limitation of the time, and not wanting to miss your shot is due to how many bullets it takes to defeat an enemy and how much ammo you can afford to waste, which is the deliberate design. I've brought it up before, but I often rank the original Resident Evil over the remake in terms of scares, because dealing with zombies is scarier when you can't so easily get away from them with the tank controls, something that's optional in the Resident Evil remake. More maneuverability makes it easier to dodge past things, rather than more of a challenge with the tank controls. This is a very minor change in terms of accessibility that has a profound effect on the game. Resource management itself, though, is a specific type of challenge that bridges the gap between puzzle and skill, knowing what to take with you and leave behind, and being able to gauge how much you need to survive the journey ahead. If you're lacking in your ability to aim correctly and kill things, then you might need to take more ammo with you. Something Resident Evil Code Veronica really stresses. Exploring an area with low health or little ammo is a desperate endeavour indeed. But is increased difficulty a good way to make a game scarier? Does making the situation harder make for a more intense experience? General game difficulty can really affect anyone's perception of a game and radically change their opinion on what is and what isn't scary. I've always maintained that difficulty is a fine balance for a horror game because of immersion. As long as the challenge is fair, the player won't get taken out of the moment. But once the player is challenged too much, or worse, frustrated, then the illusion of the experience they're having is shattered, and it's not something they're experiencing, it's just a game again. And this is very different for each player, with thresholds for what's immersion breaking. There's no one thing fixes all, and to go back to Silent Hill difficulty options, this is still far more versatile than a lot of games get, with you being able to choose easier combat if you prefer it, and harder puzzles if you prefer it. STALKER Shadow of Chernobyl is a pretty challenging game on a skill level. Its combat is fast and frantic and requires you to be alert and precise, because death is swift and unforgiving, and there are so many ways to die, from simply being outclassed in combat, caught by surprise, killed by radiation, sucked into anomalies, the list goes on. It's a game with so many layering mechanics that any decision you make can become the cause of your undoing, which makes every step you take through the game have a level of weight to it. Each step is calculated, every option needs to be considered, which adds to the game's already fantastic atmosphere to make STALKER oppressive through its gameplay, as well as other qualities like sound design and its foreboding landscapes. In STALKER's case, the potential difficulty adds to the atmosphere. There's more things at risk, more weight to it. Look at Resident Evil and its typewriter save system. If you die, you go back. That's a given in any game. But how far you go back is determined by how many ink ribbons you've collected and how long it's been since you last used them. Resident Evil is kind enough to provide you with several ink ribbons, but it's not generous, and your skill in the game is still tested. Make too many mistakes, save too often, and you'll crawl slowly into a corner until you're done. But at least you can load an earlier save. Maybe not if you're brand new to this series, but once you know the limitation is there, you'll always know. Another thing that will lurk in the back of your mind. A lot of games' difficulty pivots on your understanding of the mechanics, environments, and how to best utilize its items. To go back to Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, that game has a similar save system to Resident Evil, by providing you with save charms, an item that lets you save anywhere in the game, no fixed point stations like Resident Evil. And by the end of my most recent playthrough, I had quite a few of them. There was very little tension the entire time, because the save charms combined with a large number of healing items and ammunition meant that it's really quite hard to die in the game. Enemies are less threatening because you've got so much ammo and healing, and it's easy to surmise that the game is easy, but I can only make that statement because I know the game very well. If I didn't, then I'd need that ammunition more, I'd need those health items more, I'd wander around lost, I'd die more, I'd need to save the game more, check the map more, look up puzzle solutions. It would take me longer to complete the game, and as a result the game tension would increase exponentially, the higher the risk there is of death. But to loop around, the more you die, the more you learn. I didn't learn the ins and outs of Alone in the Dark without dying. People can complete Resident Evil with just a combat knife and don't even bother saving the game, and I doubt at that point there's any fear left in the game to be had. Games that kill you too much invalidate themselves. How can you be afraid of something you've seen so many times? Repeating things until you're going through the motions. Muscle memory. Whilst dying in a horror game is where some of the fear lies, where the tension leads to, exploring the unknown with the hanging consequences lurking in your mind, then death, rebirth, and retrying is what emboldens you until the fear is gone. Punishment through death is a way to make you more afraid of dying, but so are things like limited saves in Resident Evil and long distances between checkpoints in Bloodborne. Being afraid of dying in a game is only as frightening as you are afraid to redo something. It's still a game. Death is just an inconvenience. Maybe games like Amnesia Justine that have permadeath where the game closes itself if you die, but even then the game is short and there's not that much to replay, and this time you'll know more. In many ways, a game that is too challenging becomes less frightening. You'll never forget the moments you were afraid, but you'll remember differently the times you succeeded, the fear being something along with the challenge that you defeated. Ideally, the perfect horror game would still be able to kill you, but make it rare enough not to impede your journey through the game. A threat, but not one that becomes a chore. Something that raises tension, but still allows you to experience things like the sound design and the atmosphere and story that make games like Stalker so good. Even Stalker has a quick save to put you back into the action fast enough to never feel as though the death you received was a detriment to the experience, just a speed bump. And finally, there's accessibility. Not every game is for everyone, but things like the Silent Hill difficulty options go a long way to help. That's all for today. This has been quite the video to write, and I've really ended up leaving quite late to write it. I haven't been well of late, and the heat has been detrimental to my ability to focus, so thanks again to those of you who watched it, and to the wonderful patrons who make videos like this possible. Peace.